For today, it is with great pleasure to have an international expert with us whose works have been instrumental in understanding the experiences of people with illness from a linguistic perspective. Our speaker is a professor at the Department of Linguistics and English Language at Lancaster University. She is the director of the Economic and Social Science Research Council Center for Corpus Approaches to Social Sciences. She holds a visiting professorship in the Faculty of Foreign Languages at Fuzhou University in China. In 2011 to 2014 and 2015 to 2018, she served as the head of the Department of Linguistics and English Language in the same university. Our speaker is no doubt a prolific writer for having written over 101 articles in the areas of health communication, medical humanities, stylistics, and medical theory, where she combines qualitative analysis with corpus linguistic methods. Everyone, please help me welcome Professor Dr. Elena Semino.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's lovely to meet you all. Shall I share my screen?
Sure.
Okay. Right, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's good.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to start. So I'm Elena Semino from Lancaster University. I am absolutely delighted to be talking to you today. I was saying before, I've never visited Thailand. I would love to visit. The next best thing to be talking to you in this way. Of course, like every other speaker in this series, because I'm at home, the doorbell might ring and maybe a lorry delivering something outside. I live just opposite a private hospital, but I'm sure you'll be able to take all of that in your stride. If there's any technical problems, if you can't hear me, if you would like me to slow down, I'm quite happy to be interrupted. Otherwise, I'm just going to give about 60 or so minutes of talk, and then I'll be very happy to take questions and comments of any kind. Okay, so my research for the last maybe 8 years or so has been primarily on applying the methods and the insights of linguistics to issues to do with illness and healthcare. I don't think you as an audience need to be convinced that this is important, but let me just summarize why this is important, why linguistics has something to contribute to an understanding of illness and to healthcare, especially in the area of communication. Well, communication and language in particular are actually everywhere in our experience of illness and the healthcare system. A lot of work has been done by many people. I haven't particularly worked in this area on what is sometimes called doctor-patient communication, or rather communication between healthcare professionals, including nurses and different professions, and patients. And of course, we all know from the experience of just visiting our doctor that a lot of what happens in those interactions is talk. And so that talk needs to be effective, it needs to be empathetic in order for things to work well. And there is a lot of evidence that adverse events often linked to a failure of communication. And that communication also includes, very importantly, communication between healthcare professionals. So people are increasingly turning their attention to the communication that happens within teams of healthcare professionals. And again, in terms of what works well and what problems there might be. So there's work going on in Australia, for example, on handovers between nurses in hospitals at the end of each shift. And you can imagine how important it is at that point that communication works well. There are other aspects of communication, sometimes going under the label of health literacy, where in order to be as well as you can and make the most of the healthcare system you have, you need to have the right literacy, or rather texts need to be written in such a way that they're accessible to as many people as possible, going from instructions on medication packets to medical consent forms. So there's lots of different areas in which language is important in healthcare, and where if things don't work well, there could be problems. Okay, but if language is important, then the issue is what language then? And there are some very commonly used terms in healthcare that are actually potentially confusing for people. And one example is even just something as normal as this. In English, if you have tests, medical examinations like blood tests or X-rays or whatever, you could have, or you know, a COVID test or an antibodies test. You could have positive or negative results. The test could be positive or negative, but in most cases, positive means bad news and negative means at least neutral news, or sometimes even good news. So the way in which those terms are used in relation to medical test results is actually the opposite of, or almost the opposite of, what those terms mean in general conversation. There are many similar examples in relation to cancer. For example, progressive disease is very bad news. It means that the cancer is spreading and is active. Often it's used as an alternative to incurable. And so again, but progressive in general language use means something different, that for some people may be positive. And then sometimes there are expressions that are used in a semi-technical way or technical way in healthcare settings by healthcare professionals that might trigger associations in the patients or their families that might actually be counterproductive. And one example of this is, for example, harvesting organs for organ donation. This was highlighted by a study that was done a number of years ago, including Lancaster University, where they were trying to see why people were reluctant to agree to have their relatives, family members' organs donated. And one of the things that they challenged was the language that was used to talk about organ donation, including harvesting. And then, of course, I've mentioned language, but in fact, language is not the only component. Verbal language is not the only component of communication. There are images as well, there are gestures. And so I'll be saying a little bit about that too. So language communication, including nonverbal communication, is important, but how do we get it right? So I'm going to talk to you about 4 studies that are very different from each other. So it may be that some of you will find, you know, one more interesting or less interesting than the other, but hopefully there will be something for everybody. So I'll start with 2 projects about pain. One that is very specifically to do with the use of language in a diagnostic tool for pain. A project, when I said we need to consider not just verbal language, a project that looked at the use of visual images in clinical consultations about chronic pain. And then I'll tell you about 2 projects on metaphors in relation to illness. One is on metaphors and cancer. This is a project that is very well developed because it's been going on for many years. It's actually now kind of completed. And the other one is on metaphors and COVID. And as you can imagine, that is very much work in progress. But I have been doing the metaphors used to talk about COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm going to just give you a few insights into that. Okay, so let me begin with the first study to do with communication about pain. And it focuses specifically on a tool for the diagnosis of pain that uses language called the McGill Pain Questionnaire. I'm going to show it to you in a second. So the colleagues I've worked with on this project are Andrew Hardy, who's a corpus linguist at my university, and Joanna Zakrzewska, who's a pain specialist in London. Right, so why pain? Okay, so pain is a basic and fundamental human experience. We all know what it feels like. We all have pain at some point. And in some respect, in a crucial respect, pain is essential for survival because basically it tells you that your bodily tissues are being damaged. For example, if you accidentally touch a hot iron. So prototypical pain is in reaction to damage to bodily tissues, and the unpleasant sensation you get forces you into sometimes an automatic reaction that reduces that damage, like moving your arm away from a hot iron. That pain, which I've called prototypical, is also known as nociceptive pain, so pain that results from damage to bodily tissues. But it's not the only type of pain. We also experience pain sometimes when there is no damage to our bodily tissues or no current damage to our bodily tissues, but because there is something in the nervous system that causes that sensation, and that is broadly known as neuropathic pain. So the most extreme case of neuropathic pain is what is known as phantom limb pain, the pain that people have in a limb that has been amputated. So there's no longer, the part of the body where the pain is experienced is no longer there, but the brain circuits associated with it are still functioning or firing, causing the unpleasant sensation. But more common pains, such as some migraines and some backaches, etc., are neuropathic. And then there are, of course, conditions that cause pain, like related to immune system, that are neuropathic pain. Now, pain is a challenge for communication. It's hard to express in language, to do justice to in language, especially literal language. And this is particularly important when the pain is neuropathic and chronic, when it goes on for a long time. So this is an example of a patient in one of the projects I was involved in. To make family and friends understand is even harder. When you look physically fine, I found it extremely hard to make doctors understand the extent of my pain. And someone like this would have chronic pain. Chronic pain is defined as pain experienced continuously, at least every day, for more than 3, 4, or 5, 6 months, depending on the definitions. Now, I won't focus a lot on this, but only a little on this. Pain is often, it turns out, described metaphorically. And the reason for that is that if you take English, and you may want to think about Thai or other languages that you know, English has very few words that primarily express pain sensation. So where they have literal core meanings that are about pain. So pain and its sort of family, pain, painful, hurt, ache, sore, are about it in terms of literal references to pain sensations. But obviously the pains to express in language, to get other people to understand our pain, those are not enough. They're very generic. And so we often turn to metaphorical ways of referring to pain. So we compare our sensations with something else that might give the person a sense of what it's like. And the quote that you have on the slide is from a doctor who wrote, "Attempts to truly describe pain indeed appear as difficult as they're frustrating, yet the need to communicate is overwhelming." And I suggest that the only option available is the resort to analogy, whether by means of metaphor or simile. And for example, we talk about a stabbing pain, a burning pain, a splitting headache. So we compare our pain to what you would experience if somebody was attacking your body in some way, your body was breaking down, even when, of course, those things are not happening. Okay, so all of this by way of preamble. So when doctors are trying to understand or to get you to articulate your pain so that they can see if they can do something about it, they have to use different tools. Some of them are quantitative. I'm sure many of you will have been asked, on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is no pain and 10 is the worst pain you can imagine, how bad is your pain? And that is a measure of pain intensity. You are expressing the degree to which you're experiencing pain. But the other aspect of pain that is important is what kind of pain is it? The quality of the pain sensation, not just the intensity. So the pain of toothache is different from backache, etc. And not all toothaches and backaches are the same. So how do you express that? So the questionnaire, the diagnostic questionnaire I'm going to talk about is called the McGill Pain Questionnaire. It was devised in Canada at McGill University in the late 1970s. And at the time, it was revolutionary because it included linguistic descriptors. It wasn't just a quantitative approach where you had to place your pain on a numerical scale. So you can see the structure here. So the main part of the questionnaire has 78 linguistic descriptors. These descriptors are divided into 20 groups. each group aims to capture a type of pain, a quality of pain sensation. So for example, you can see 7 at the bottom of the inset bit, hot, burning, scalding, searing, is for people who have a heat sensation associated with the pain. Others might be more to do with cutting the body or pressure, so sharp, cutting, lacerating, etc. So this questionnaire is administered like this. The doctor is sitting in front of the patient and starts using this questionnaire. They read out each group at a time. So they might read out for group 3, picking, boring, drilling, stabbing, lancinating. And then the patient can either say, no, this pain, this type of pain does not apply to me, so they don't pick that group. So if a patient's pain does not feel hot, they don't pick from group 7. Or they might say, yes, my pain does feel like that. And then in that case, they have to pick one descriptor from the group, because within each group, the descriptors are intended to be listed in order of increasing intensity of that type of pain. So in group 7 for heat, hot is the least intense, searing is the most intense. In group 3, pricking is the least intense, and lancinating is the most intense. So the point of the questionnaire when they devised it was, by having the different groups, we're capturing different kinds of pain. And then inside each group, by having the rank order of descriptors, we're capturing intensity, okay? So there we are. The questionnaire relies on a distinction between quality of pain sensation across groups and intensity within groups. The problem is that as linguists, we know that if you take 78 words to describe something, they will vary across many more dimensions than just those two, than just the kind of pain they describe and the intensity of the pain. There is much more variation than that. And so the question for a linguist is, what kind of variation is there, and is it a problem? Now, when I was approached by Joanna Zakrzewska, the pain consultant, to look at this questionnaire, the people in the field already knew that even though this questionnaire is is a kind of classic questionnaire and it's very widely used, there are problems with it. So from the medical literature on it, people pointed out some descriptors have multiple meanings. So boring, for example, is in the pressure group, but actually the meaning of boring in everyday English is uninteresting. Some descriptors are difficult to understand. Rasping, lancinating actually isn't even a word in English. Some descriptors, and this is what I'm going to talk about, very relevant to pain, like tugging. Okay, so we were approached to try to see whether a linguistic analysis of the questionnaire would help understand why some descriptors don't seem to work very well. So what we did, and I'll just give you an example of what we did. We looked at the Oxford English corpus, which has 2.5 billion words of 21st century English. International English is drawn from many different types of texts. And we wanted to look at the behavior of each of the 78 descriptors in English generally, okay? So one of the things we were interested in is raw frequency. How common are these words? And I won't talk about that except to say that they vary enormously in how common they are. Some words are very common, some words are extremely rare. One word, lancinating, is only used in the questionnaire. The other thing, we wanted to see how often these words were used actually to describe pain. So we looked at the number of occurrences of the word pain in a window, 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right of each descriptor, one way of calculating collocations. So within that window, 24 descriptors have 10 or fewer instances of pain. So some of these descriptors are not very commonly used to describe pain. And the range is enormous. So rasping has no instances of the word pain in that window, 5 words to the left, 5 words to the right, in the whole corpus, Whereas sharp, as you can imagine, has nearly 1,000, because sharp pain is a common way of describing pain. So this is where we looked, right? So with sharp, if you look at the, this is a concordance of sharp. If you look at 5 words to the left, 5 words to the right, you will find some instances of pain, the one roughly in the middle, a very sharp pain in my right breast. With rasping, when we looked in that window, there were no instances. The question is, does this matter? Does this matter? And what we hypothesized was that the strength of the association between each descriptor and pain in English might influence people's choices in a way that undermined some aspect of the questionnaire. So we took 800 completed questionnaires from Joanna's hospital. These were all people who had pain in the face for more than 3 months. We considered each group of descriptors separately and asked the question, okay, if somebody picks from a group, if they have the pain captured by a particular group, which descriptor are they most likely to pick? And we made the prediction. Remember that for the questionnaire, when somebody picks from a group, their choice influences the assessment of intensity of pain. But we wanted to see whether the strength of the association between the descriptors and pain influenced people's selections, so that they picked because there was a strong association between that descriptor and pain, rather than because that descriptor captured the intensity of their own pain. And we calculated correlations. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but we found that for 10 out of the 20 groups in the questionnaire, we could show that the strength of collocation between the descriptors and pain could explain people's choices, so that people picked on the basis of that association, because that association is in their heads, rather than because of the intensity of their pain. So there were 5 groups where, let me show you this picture. Right, there were 5 groups where one of the descriptors collocated with pain much more than the others. So normally, if I was with you, I would be pointing at the screen. So let me explain this. So this is group 2. On the left, the horizontal bars give you how many times that descriptor was chosen by the patients, okay? So in this group, jumping, flashing, shooting. Shooting is the most intense, and it was picked the most often, right? On the right, you have the number of times that the word pain turns up in that window around the descriptor in the corpus, right? So the fact that the two parts of the slide look the same show you that people tend to pick the descriptor that has the strongest association with pain in the corpus. Here it's at the top of the intensity scale. Here it's also stabbing. They pick stabbing, it's also towards the top. Here it's in the middle, throbbing. Here it's also in the middle. Here it's at the bottom. So in that group, sharp, cutting, lacerating, sharp is the least intense. It's also the one that has the strongest association with pain. People pick that. So if you look at other groups, now you see, if the bars look the same, there's a correlation, right? So you can see that. What does this all mean? Remember that in the questionnaire, the descriptors are rank ordered by intensity of pain. So the people need to, for it to work, to measure intensity, people need to pick according to intensity. Instead, what we found is for at least 10 out of the 20 groups, the choice can be explained largely or entirely in terms of the strength of the collocation, the association between that descriptor and pain. So this undermines the reliability of the intensity scales for those groups. And so our findings have implications for how people use the current questionnaire. They can't trust, they can't use people's answers to measure intensity, at least for those groups. There are shorter versions of the questionnaire that capture intensity differently. So there are implications perhaps that those might be better, and also future versions of the questionnaire. As well as other questionnaires that you might devise. There is also a whole issue of translation that I won't go into. So this is one example where people came to us with a question about some problems with a language-based tool, and we did some research to pinpoint those problems. Okay, so I'm going now to show you a different study, still about pain, but this is to do with using visual images in consultations about pain. These are my main collaborators. Joanna in the middle, you're familiar with. Deborah Padfield is an artist, and Amanda Williams is a psychologist. So this project resulted from two previous projects that I wasn't involved in, where basically Deborah, the artist, worked with clinicians in pain clinics in London to produce visual representations of people's pain. Patients with chronic pain were invited to work with Deborah to produce photographs that represented their experience of pain. The photographs, as you'll see, mostly involve visual metaphors, and we analyzed them, my colleagues and I, in a book that came out in 2013. These are some examples. So patients sat with the artist, discussed what should be in these photographs that represented their pain, and then Deborah began to put together those photographs, and there was a cyclical process of interaction until the patient said, yes, this is a good visual representation of my pain. And you can see that they vary. There's some stuff to do with heat and cutting, insects crawling. The one bottom left is somebody who says that they're in a cement straitjacket and a falling house of cards. There are many. Then, having produced all these images that were also printed as a pack of cards, a new project was started to see whether it was possible to use these cards to help other patients, especially in consultations with their doctors. So the pain cards were made available in the waiting room of a specialist clinic in a London hospital, and people were told, okay, while you're waiting, look at these cards with all these different images that people like you have produced in the past, and if any of them you think would be helpful when you speak to the doctor, take them into the consultation with you. Now, this then led to the question, there were video recordings of consultations, and this led to the question, what difference, if any, do the pain cards make to the pain consultations? And I was brought in on the team as a linguist. It was a multidisciplinary team to provide a linguistic perspective to try to answer this question. So we had transcripts of video recordings of 17 consultations using the images. We also had some consultations with the same consultants without the images, but today I'm not going to talk about those. So I decided to make a distinction between the sections of these consultations where the cards are actively being used, what I'm calling card data, and the remaining sections of the consultations. Let me explain why I did this a bit more clearly. As I said, we have these 17 consultations, video recorded and transcribed, where the images are present. And then we also have about 20 consultations with the same doctors, but different patients without the images. And initially we thought we would compare those two sets. The problem is that because the patients are different in the two groups, and they're not matched for exactly the same, whether they have exactly the same type of pain, and especially if we're talking to a medical audience, will be undermined by people saying, yes, but they're different patients, that's why you find a difference. So we decided to compare inside the set of consultations with the images by making this distinction, because there are whole parts of the consultations where the images are not used, but there are sections of the consultations where they are used. So we wanted to see within the set, what difference, how does the language, in my case, change when the cards are actively being used? Okay, one finding that applies to all patients as well as an average is that when the cards, the images are being used, the patients speak more than when they're not, okay? Most of the time, the consultants still speak more than the patient. But when the cards are used, the patients speak more. So because they're explaining why they pick that card, but in the meantime, they say some things that are important for the consultation. So what I did a computer-aided linguistic analysis of these two mini corpora, right? All the bits where the cards are being used in one data set, and all the bits where the cards are not being used as the comparison data set. And I used, for corpus linguists, I'll give the details. If you're not corpus linguists, don't worry, but I used W matrix to to tag my data for semantic fields. And then I compared card data with rest data. And basically what I get, and this is for everybody, what I got from this analysis was the areas of meaning, the semantic fields that are used much more often in card data than rest data. In other words, used much more often when the cards are being used than when the cards are not being used, okay? A difference that has statistical significance. So let me look at the patients in particular. What areas of meaning do they use more when the cards are being talked about? Okay, here we are. So in bold are the semantic fields as in the computational tool that I used. That to do with temperature, electricity, constraint, and violence. And in italics, you have the words, example words from those semantic fields like burning, electric shock, tight, stabbing, poking. So here what you can see is there are more figurative descriptions of what the pain feels like. Okay, they're not unlike the things that are in that questionnaire I've just talked about. There are also more references to parts of the body, partly because they're saying where the pain is. So one of the things, and this is not a surprising finding, but one of the things that we found was that when the cards are used, people spend more time, or rather they use the cards to help express what the pain feels like. Okay, this wasn't a surprise. But what was more of a surprise is that when the cards are being used, patients use more words that are to do with thoughts and feelings. So words like feel, think, feeling, feels. And also maximizes expressions of intensity like all, literally, most, completely, etc. This is important because when people have chronic pain, and some of you may have chronic pain, because chronic pain affects about 20-25% of adults around the world. So when people have chronic pain, the pain is not just a kind of physical experience, it's an emotional experience. It affects mood, it can cause depression. So when a pain specialist talks with a patient with chronic pain, they, amongst other things, they also want to see how well the patient is doing, how it's affecting their daily life, how it's affecting their emotions. And so finding that there are more words to do with feelings when the cards are being used is important. And actually, when you look, for example, this is a concordance of feel, you can see that patients use feel to do 3 different things: to express what the pain feels like, often metaphorically. I feel as if I'm on fire. Crucially, to talk about how their pain affects their daily life. And this is part of what the consultant wants to know about. I feel there are some things I'm not able to do anymore. And then emotional states, including expressed metaphorically, I feel lost, I don't know what to do. So this is important. We found that the use of the cards seems to be leading to more emotional disclosure on the part of the patients, which is something that some doctors will value in that context. And I'll just give you an example of what that emotional disclosure can lead to. So this is one of the cards. And basically it was created by somebody who wanted to have this little rag doll with her own face, and the rag doll was in different places in different photos. And a patient picks it. Remember, these are different people, right? There's the people who created the images with the artist, but these are a different group of people in a different project. And the patient says, to explain that card, this is when I'm completely like a rag doll, when I'm so exhausted I can't walk, and I just want to go, oh, it's my I've had enough days, you know, when you go, oh God, what's the point of living and stuff. This is crucial because what in extreme cases, chronic lead to suicidal thoughts. And you can see that here the patient is turning the image into a simile and completely like a rag doll, and then they go on to express the feeling that they don't see sometimes they don't see the point of living. in the rest of the excerpt, I'm not going to read it in detail, but they talk about how they feel bad about lying to people about why they can't go out with friends, because they don't want to talk about the pain all the time, so they make up excuses and then they feel bad. So what we found was, we know the pain sensations are difficult to articulate, but when visual images are used, what seems to happen is patients speak more, there are more descriptions of what the pain feels like, figurative, there are more references to thoughts on how the pain impacts the patient's life. So this suggests that there might be some use for visual images in pain consultations. I should say also that while there's been enormous interest in this study, and Deborah often gets asked to share the cards and give workshops, it's been harder to find a way of publishing this research, because the methods that we use are rather unfamiliar or unusual for medical journals. So interdisciplinary research is great, and I'll carry on doing it, but it's not the easiest research to publish. Having said that, a kind of comment piece on this was published in The Lancet, which is one of the most prestigious medical journals in the UK, but as a comment piece rather than a research piece. But we do have some publications from this. Okay, I hope everyone's okay. The next bit, I'm going to talk about our project on metaphors and cancer. And all of these things are potentially upsetting. But if this could be particularly upsetting for you, mute me for about 10 minutes and come back for the COVID bit. Not that the COVID bit is particularly fun, but it's the examples are not as harrowing as this. Okay, so since 2012, I've been working on metaphors for cancer with all these people who include linguists of different varieties, an end-of-life care specialist and an oncologist. So the background for this, why did we do a project on metaphors and cancer? Well, I don't know what it's like in Thailand, but certainly in the UK, having cancer is often talked about metaphorically in terms of some kind of fight, a battle against disease that you have to win. So typical obituaries that might appear in a newspaper when somebody dies, I like the one bottom left. Comedian Victoria Wood has died aged 62 after a short battle with cancer, her publicist said. So there's this dominant metaphor, and this metaphor of fighting the disease is both dominant and very controversial, right? It's been criticized from many different perspectives. But why is metaphor important? Many of you, or maybe all of you, won't need this, but just briefly. Metaphor involves talking and potentially thinking about one thing in terms of another, where the two things are different, but we can perceive a similarity between them. So, for example, battling cancer, we talk about one thing, the experience of trying to get better from cancer in terms of another, battles, on the basis of a perception of similarity between them. Both are difficult, both can end in success or failure, etc. Crucially, different metaphors frame the topic in different ways, highlighting some aspects and backgrounding others. Many of you will be familiar with conceptual metaphor theory by Lakoff and Johnson. They were amongst the first to emphasize how metaphors are not just a way of talking about things, but they also reflect how we think about things and maybe how we experience them. We've just seen lots of metaphors in the pain data. Crucially, there is empirical experimental evidence that shows that metaphors do affect how we feel and reason about topics. So there are many studies where people in a laboratory condition, people are given different versions of the same text about a topic, and the differences are whether the topic is described metaphorically or literally or using different metaphors. And what people tend to find is that if you ask the same questions at the end, after people have read the text, there is evidence that the metaphor they were exposed to influences how they reason about the topic. So there's empirical evidence for this. Now, I mentioned that the battle metaphor is controversial. Some of you may be familiar with Susan Sontag's book, Illness as Metaphor, from 1979. She criticized the use of military metaphors for cancer and also TB at the time, because of their violent connotations, because they potentially disempower the patient, etc. I'll come back to more criticisms. This is an example of a journalist who had breast cancer and then was treated successfully. At the time, she said, I'm noticing that people talk about cancer in terms of fighting all the time. And then she says, why should people with cancer be expected to take up arms? It is better to see cancer as a journey. Everyone says that being positive helps you to come through, and being positive during a journey seems easier to me than being positive during a war in which the enemy is all around you. So you can see that here she takes issue with the framing that is suggested by the battle metaphor, the war metaphor, and that her particular issue is that you're surrounded by a war which is not conducive to trying to stay as positive as possible, and she prefers a journey metaphor. Notice in the journey metaphor, there is no opponent. You're not trying to fight anyone. So they have very different framings. In one, the illness is the enemy that you have to beat. In the other one, usually the illness is the road that you travel on, which might be a very difficult road, as we'll see. In the UK, for more than 10 years now, official documents on cancer have avoided fighting type vocabulary, and they have adopted the journey metaphor. So this is from the 2007 NHS, National Health Service Cancer Reform Strategy. You can see that they talk about a cancer journey. And then they also talk about pathways generally, not just for cancer. So what we did was we collected a lot of data because we wanted to use corpus methods. So we had data from 3 groups of people: patients, family carers, so somebody looking after usually a family member, and healthcare professionals. And for each group, we had interviews, semi-structured interviews, and we looked at online forum posts. The numbers there and the number of words in each data set for a total of about 1.5 million words. And you can see that we've got about 80 to 100,000 words of interviews for each group. There is, as you can see, a big difference in the numbers for online forum posts, 500,000 words each for patients and carers, less for healthcare professionals, because we had more trouble finding we were only using forums that are open, so where you don't need a password to read the posts, and that is much harder to find for healthcare professionals than for patients and carers. I can talk more about the difficulties we had if you're interested with this. So in terms of methods, I'm happy to answer questions about this. I'm not going into the detail, but basically we did a manual analysis of a sample of the data. In other words, we took a sample from each data set and analyzed it manually using a metaphor identification procedure to see what metaphors we could find. And then we used the computer-aided methods of corpus linguistics to scale up the analysis to the whole corpus. So in terms of quantitative results, these are raw figures, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I just want you to look at the column on the left. We found 10 main different types of metaphors. Violence, journey, the most common. And violence includes all the battles. It's a term for all the battles and the fights, etc. But then also metaphors of restraint, metaphors of the animals, openness, sports and games, religion and magic, obstacles, wholeness, and machines. I'm going to focus on violence and journey metaphors mostly, but just to give you an idea of how cancer is described metaphorically, it is described negatively as some kind of malevolent agent, a beast, a monster, a demon, but also sometimes more humorously or even affectionately, like as Mr. C, or some people give their cancer a name like Hefty or Buttercup. So we found a variety, not just a variety of metaphors, but a variety of associations of metaphors, including humorous ones that we actually studied. We have quite a lot of several publications now on the humor we found in the corpus. Again, I'm happy to answer questions. I won't be talking about that. But one of the things we wanted to find out was, there is all this discussion about violence metaphors, fights, battles, being potentially negative, and perhaps journey metaphors being better So we wanted to see whether we could find textual evidence of that difference. On the one hand, we did find that we found textual evidence that these violence metaphors can be, in our terms, disempowering, can deprive the patient of agency and make them even feel guilty for their illness. So this is a very clear example of that. I feel such a failure that I'm not winning this battle. So this person has just said that their cancer has spread. And notice that they use the word failure, right? Now, in that situation, it is normal to be distressed, to be angry, but why should you feel a failure? It's the treatment that hasn't worked. It's not you who somehow are at fault. But notice that I feel such a failure that I am not winning this battle. So the whole idea of battles is that if you're strong and you fight hard enough, you win. And so framing the relationship with the disease and trying to get better as a battle can lead to the inference, if you don't get better, that somehow it's because of you as a not good enough fighter. So here is textual evidence that when treatment doesn't work, when the illness spreads or in the terminal phases, this framing, this metaphorical framing, can be really counterproductive for people. And here is another example of somebody projecting that possibility in the future. What will people think? She says, I talk about fighting my illness, but people might then think, you see, I knew she couldn't do it. So we have textual evidence that these metaphors are problematic. However, for some people, some of the time, these metaphors do work, including in empowering way to make them feel in charge of things. So one person says cancer and the fighting of it is something to be proud of. And the person says, my consultants recognize I was a born fighter, and so my determination to prove them wrong. Another person says, I don't intend to give up. I don't intend to give in. No, I want to fight it. I don't want it to beat me. I want to beat it. You know, and if you're into transitivity, you can see the contrast between the two structures. So because we're all different, and because cancer has so many different stages and variants, there is evidence that violence metaphors can be problematic, so they should not be imposed on anybody, and they shouldn't be as dominant as they are. But it is also the case that for some people, some of the time, they may be empowering, motivating, and giving people a sense of identity. The main thing is that they're not the only metaphor we have. What happens with journeys? Well, we found a similar thing. Journey metaphors at least don't have an enemy. They don't have the kind of counterproductive effects that violence metaphors can have. And in some cases, they may even be used to capture some of the positives or find positives in a negative experience. So one person says, my journey may not be smooth, but it certainly makes me look up and take notice of the scenery. Now, people often talk about traumatic experiences, including cancer, as something that gets them to appreciate the good things in life, the important things in life much more, or that gives new experiences, for example, meeting people with a lot in common, that might actually be a positive in what is generally a very negative experience. The journey metaphor has a way of expressing that by this notion of the scenery, that you're enjoying new scenery. However, journey metaphors are also used to express frustration. So this person says, how the hell am I supposed to know how to navigate this road I do not even want to be on when I've never done it before? So, and some people just don't like them because they find them cliched. So basically, we found a variety of metaphors. We found that violence and journey metaphors are the most frequent in our data. We found more evidence of potentially harmful effects of violence metaphors, but we also found that both violence and journey metaphors can be used in empowering or disempowering ways, depending on who the person is, the context, how they use the metaphors. So that led us then to implications for the practical applications of our research. And this was inspired by, we had, while we were doing the project, we had a group of local people who had been involved with cancer in different ways, either because they had it, they looked after someone with cancer, or because they volunteered in that sector. And then we brought them into campus and gave them coffee or lunch and asked them for feedback and discussed our research with them, which was very enlightening and a very different experience from discussing research with other researchers. And on one occasion, one of the members of the group asked me, as the principal investigator of the project, so what are you going to do that is going to be helpful for people from all this research that you're doing? Are you going to produce a list of good metaphors and a list of bad metaphors so that people know what to do? And at the time, and you just seen our results, right? I said, well, we can't quite do that because different metaphors work differently for different people. So that there aren't any metaphors that are good for everybody and any metaphors that are bad for everybody. So I gave that answer basically, and then I went home. And I thought, well, I've just given this person the classic academic answer. I've basically said, things are more complicated than you think. And in that way, I've kind of got out of trying to do something useful. So I thought that cannot be the best way to address the question. So I tried to think of a way of addressing the spirit of that question. Are you going to produce something useful? Rather than the letter of the question, the do's and don'ts, the good and bad metaphor. So the idea that I came up with is the idea of a metaphor menu, and that's another metaphor, for people with cancer, which is a collection of quotes from people with cancer, accompanied by images that involve different metaphors. And the idea is we're not prescribing, we're giving people options, a range of options. And the metaphor of the menu works because, like in a restaurant, you may like one thing, your friend may like another. Those options are equally valid. And both of you are catered for. You don't have to like the same things, but also there's a lot of choice. So this is what the metaphor looks like. It exists as a booklet, and the metaphor menu looks as a booklet and a pack of cards that we used when we could still meet people. We used in workshops and activities. And I'll give you some examples. These are all quotes either from the data or from other people with cancer, some of them used out of context. Imagine it a bit like a scary fairground ride. It might be scary in places, but it will eventually stop and you can get off. Be strong, be brave, and we will be there to hold your hand if you need it. This is a musical metaphor. Cancer is part of me. The cure for cancer is accepting it. To heal is to convince the cancer cells to sing in tune with the rest of the body. So here you can see that the goal is neither a journey that you need to get to the end of or an enemy that you have to fight, but reestablishing musical harmony. And this idea of harmony in the body, balance, is something that may be familiar to many of you, that it's not that common in Western medicine, to make a big generalization, but it is more common in others. So we've now made the metaphor menu available in many contexts, and we had really good responses. This is from somebody in Northwest Cancer Research who says it's really useful. This is from somebody who used to be a cancer patient. And Cancer Research UK, which is one of the two biggest cancer charities in the UK, has made it available as part of their recommended reading list on their website. And basically, if you want the link, the metaphor menu, if people are interested, I can put it in the chat. It's downloadable. It's available for anyone who wants to use it. Okay, so yeah, I thought that I've got a few more minutes. I hope you can bear with me. And I'll tell you, just give you some brief observations about metaphors and COVID. When the pandemic started, I have to say that there were many things that were overwhelming, like with everyone else. But for me, one of the things that was overwhelming was how many metaphors were being used for the virus and the pandemic by so many different people, how much discussion there was of metaphors, even in newspapers. And so I was almost paralyzed at the beginning by having too much data, knowing how to collect it and how to go about doing a study. But then little by little, I got over that. So in many countries, but certainly in the UK, at least at the beginning, the main metaphors that were used were the predictable ones, right? The virus as an enemy to be defeated. So there were military metaphors, war metaphors, violence metaphors. So this is from the 18th of March, Downing Street. So UK Prime Minister. And I've got a screenshot because you can see the capitals and the underlining. So we need to beat this crisis. If you look at the third paragraph, yes, this enemy can be deadly, but it is also beatable, and we know how to beat it. And we know that if as a country we follow the scientific advice, this is not being given. We know that we will beat it, and however tough the months ahead we have the resolve and the resources to win the fight, right? So at the beginning, it tended to be all like this. And these metaphors have the same disadvantages that I've already mentioned in relation to cancer. Here, notice they're applied to the societal effort, not the individual effort. But on the one hand, they can probably work well as a kind of, the idea of the call to arms. All of a sudden, we were all required to change our lifestyles completely. And so the idea of being in a joint war could be quite useful. At the same time, these metaphors were criticized, as I say, very often in the media and on social media for many different reasons. This is not going to be, there's not going to be a clear outcome for this. We can't win for a very long time. They were criticized because some governments could use them to justify authoritarian measures. So if we're in a war, then you need to give us all the power to do anything we want. But also because at the individual level, they could have consequences that are counterproductive. So there have been studies that have looked at how, for example, war metaphors affect people's intentions to engage in preventative behaviors. So for example, behaviors that you might want to, lifestyle choices that you might want to have to reduce your chances of getting cancer. And these metaphors are not good, we have evidence, they're not good at encouraging people to do nothing. And for most of us in lockdown, actually what we had to do was refrain from activity, not engage in intense activity. So in that sense, you had to fight by doing nothing, by staying home. And so it's not a good framing for justifying that. But anyway, they have their uses, but the observation was that they were used and criticized. However, there were other metaphors too. This is from an Italian virologist who spent a lot of time on TV when the pandemic was at its most severe phase in Italy. I haven't got you the precise quote, but basically at one point he was asked on TV, this is prime time, Sunday evening talk show. He was asked, okay, so when the cases finally begin to go down, are we going to be okay? And will we be able to start living normally again? And he used the football metaphor, and football is the main sport in Italy, and that everybody, or most people, have knowledge about and often strong feelings about. And his answer was, he said, when we get to the point where the cases are going down, we will be like a team, a football team, that at some point was losing 3-0 and has managed with a lot of effort to equalize, to get to 3-3, but the match is not finished. So if you stop making an effort at that point, you've wasted the effort that went into getting back to 3-3, and you still run the risk of losing the game. So he used the sports metaphor to explain what might still be needed, the fact that measures would still be needed even when infections were beginning to go down. But there are many other metaphors, journey metaphors, lots of marathons, tsunamis, COVID as a test that we need to learn from, or an exam, and even COVID as glitter. There's a couple of examples where, to explain how the virus is very difficult to eradicate, people said it's like glitter, that if you have a children's party, gets into all the sofas, etc., and you find it years later, you think you've got rid of it, but it's still, some glitter is still there. So, and many others. So in this, sometime in early April, a group of us interested in metaphor launched an initiative, especially with colleagues in Spain and my colleague Veronica Koller at Lancaster. We launched an international initiative called Reframe COVID, which basically aims to collect metaphors for COVID that are not war metaphors in as many different languages as possible. You've got the link there. I can put it in the chat. But basically, it's a spreadsheet. It's open source spreadsheet where anybody can go in, put a name in, and put their examples of metaphors in different languages, in any language, and also visual metaphors. And then anybody can use that collection as data as long as they acknowledge the source. So it's a new, we also thought that it would be a good time, a pandemic would be a good time to also move beyond a situation where there is my data and your data. In fact, there is in research increasingly the expectation that we share our data. And this is a joint data collection activity. And it's been really successful. There's been interest in the press in Spain, the UK, and also we've given talks, and we are working on publications now. What I want to finish with, just a couple of minutes, is on one particular type of metaphor, metaphors of COVID as a fire. And the reason why I'm focusing on these is that right from the beginning, I noticed that fire metaphors were being used in ways that I thought were particularly adequate for what we're dealing with as a general observation. But also, and if you go back to the metaphor menu, so as linguists, we take obviously a descriptive approach to language use, not a prescriptive one. So, you know, the classic thing when you say to somebody that you're a linguist, they ask you how many languages you speak, and then are you going to correct my grammar? Do I need to be careful how I speak? And of course, we know that the professional ethos of linguists is that we're interested in describing language use, not prescribing, not telling people what to do. And indeed, the Reframe COVID collection is meant as a collection of data, not as a way of deciding what metaphors are better than others. However, when I get sometimes interviewed by people, I do get asked, so what are the best metaphors for COVID? What are the most useful metaphors? And I find that sometimes without becoming prescriptive, it's also a duty sometimes to say, okay, on the basis of my observations, some metaphors seem to be more appropriate than others. And I actually think that while we need all the metaphors from journeys to glitter, fire metaphors, I've seen evidence that they can be quite useful. So at the bottom I've written a blog post for the research center I direct that is available on fire metaphors. So I'll just give you a couple of examples and stop, but if you're interested, you can go to that. So I looked at the Reframe COVID collection, and I also looked in a corpus called the Coronavirus Corpus, collected by Mark Davis. It's also available, at least for basic searches, to anyone. And I looked for fire metaphors. If you want to ask me how I did it, I'll be happy to answer. And I found that they have been used, so my evidence is textual. They can be used to do a number of things that are important in relation to the pandemic, to convey danger and urgency, to distinguish between different phases of the pandemic, to explain how contagion happens and the role of individuals within that, to justify how we deal with contagion, to portray the role of health workers, or firefighters, as you can imagine, to connect the pandemic with other problems, and to outline possible futures after the pandemic. And I'll just give you two examples. So explaining how contagion happens and the measure to reduce it. So this is very important, right? Because we all have to play a part in reducing infections, but it's important to understand how contagion happens and what we can contribute. So here's an example of using a fire metaphor to do that from Medscape. Think of COVID-19 as a fire burning in the forest. All of us are trees. The R is the wind speed. The higher it is, the faster the fires tears through the forest. But just like a forest fire, COVID-19 needs fuel to keep going and burn itself out. And burn itself out. Okay, hold on. We are the fuel. If the R0 is low enough, the fire stays in one place and burns itself out. We don't all get infected. A few fire lines, quarantines and social distancing measures keep the fire from hitting all the trees. If the R is too high, the fire tears through the whole forest. We can slow it with those fire lines, but eventually everyone gets infected. And then later on, remember the R is the wind blowing through the forest. If we don't build those fire lines to slow the spread, everyone gets sick at once and we overwhelm the healthcare system. So you can see how they take the idea of COVID as a forest fire, they put our role in as trees of fuel for the fire, And then they explain how what the R means by making it making a parallel with the wind, and then showing that by using that very vivid image, that physical separation is what you need to prevent the spread. So this is an example, kind of semi-technical, of what metaphor is good at, right? To explain something complex and unfamiliar and invisible in terms of something more concrete, more visible and accessible. And fire metaphors are quite good at doing that. And I think that generally, it's not a particularly good idea to personify the virus too much, because otherwise we have this idea that we all have to be strong to fight it, whereas it's much better, I think more appropriate to say we are like trees that inadvertently might get affected and then we affect others. And finally, the future. So this is an Italian commentator who has a very extended fire metaphor for COVID, but then he says that it is everyone's duty to collaborate daily in the reclamation of the soil, so the sparks, triggers, etc., do not cause irreparable disasters now or in the future. So what I like about this is that, okay, COVID is a fire, firefighters, etc., but the crucial thing is that we also need together to look after the soil, to look after the wood, so that there aren't any fires in the future. And this is a way of basically saying, we spend so much time talking about what it's going to be like on the other side, that there is, that we need to deal long-term with the conditions that led to the pandemic, rather than just looking forward to going back to what normal might mean. And fire metaphors can be used to do that too, because there are things you can do in the land around you to prevent forest fires. So I could go on, but I've gone on way longer than I said. So I hope I've shown you, in reference to different projects, that linguistic research can help address many questions and challenges in communication about illness, both in clinical settings and in non-clinical settings. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Elena, for that wonderful talk. It's very enlightening to understand how it actually works, particularly on people experiencing, for example, cancer. It's quite new, and it's really enlightening. And I assume that all of our participants are quite thrilled to ask questions. If you do have one, please turn on your microphone, introduce yourself, and you may go ahead and ask your question.
Hello, can I ask some? Hi, Elena.
Hi.
Hi, it's really nice to see you, because I've been reading your articles for like the past semester, and I've come across so many metaphors, analysis, and finally I'm getting to hear you, and today it's so enlightening. Like Joey said, wow, it's amazing what work you're doing to help the patients and to help improve the linguistic aspect in the healthcare. I, as a person new to this metaphor, I'm reading a lot of your articles, and I know that eventually I have to read more to complete my individual study. My one question is, besides the healthcare that you're doing, you are also doing about empowering, encouraging words that you're doing already. My one question is how me as a person, as a newcomer, can work on developing my metaphor skills more, because from your study, I realized that there's very few people who are doing this. And it cannot be quantitatively analyzed as yet. Your corpus showed that there are a lot of lack of information or lack of enough studies.
Yeah. I think there are actually, there is an increasing number of studies. So there is quite a lot of research, but we've just seen it with COVID. Metaphor is such a central tool for communication and for thinking that there's always topics that we haven't looked at, or aspects we haven't looked at that need to be looked at. So in terms of, the advice I would give is, first of all, you need to find find your own area. You need to find in what area do you want to investigate metaphors. So you need to find, you know, what we sometimes call the research gap. It doesn't need to be a big gap in the sense that, for example, looking at metaphors used in your country, in your language, to talk about COVID and then make it more specific, maybe looking at government, looking at public health bodies, looking at the press, looking at social media. So there are so many different contexts in which one can do that. Our project on metaphor and cancer has been replicated, for example, in Sweden. There are people translating the metaphor menu or creating new metaphor menus, for example, in Portugal. So there are many different adaptations, and then you can come up with your own ideas. In terms of preparing, it's really important to have a clear and appropriate methodology. So you need to have a way of identifying metaphors, and if you want to use corpus methods, how you go about that. You don't have to, but also, and if you want to quantify, how you will count. But there is a substantial literature on metaphor identification, on different methodologies. So there are things that one can read and look at to be ready. Including, metaphors are not easy to count because they're not predictable in terms of their form. So using corpus methods is not entirely straightforward, but there are ways also of using corpus methods, and I have in both for the metaphor project, the cancer project, and the COVID project. So just to give you an example that's very simple, right? There is a coronavirus corpus in English. I looked for the word fire, and I then, because that corpus is enormous, I asked the software to give me all instances of COVID or coronavirus in a window 5 words to the left and 5 words to the right of the word fire. And then I ended up with about 700 examples. And then I looked manually to see in each case whether there was a fire metaphor for COVID. And I found about 40. So have I found all the fire metaphors? No, because say I didn't look for flame. I didn't look for burn. Right? So I haven't found all the fire metaphors, but I have found a reasonable number of metaphorical uses of the word fire in relation to COVID. And as I've shown you from my examples, often the metaphor was extended so that there was more fire-related vocabulary used metaphorically. In other words, I cannot say I have a quick way to find all the fire metaphors in a corpus, but I do have a systematic way to find and not enough to be able to give you what I've given you, the functions and some examples. So, you know, we have enough methods to do something that's systematic and rigorous and explicit. We don't have a magic wand whereby you have a corpus and suddenly you have a tool that finds all the metaphors. But there are ways.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ruby is actually one of our MA students at the EIL program at Chula.
That's great. That's great.
Thank you so much, Ruby. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? You may unmute yourself. There's one question here. I'm just not sure if she would like to read it or I'll do it for her. But it goes way, let's see.
Look, in the meantime, I'm going to sit down. Just bear with me.
Sure.
While you find the question.
The question in the chat, shall we?
All right, so the question goes like, the topic of this webinar is language illness and health. If I focus on all aspects of disease and healthcare mediated by language, maybe she's asking how to unify various applied linguistics tools, particularly discourse analysis, conversation analysis, metaphor analysis, and narrative analysis to understand the various contexts of care and health situation.
Yeah. So how to bring methods together.
Right.
Yeah. So I think here, basically, the crucial thing with methods is always that you need the right methods for your research questions and your data. It is really useful to combine methods. So for example, in our case, when I use corpus methods, the corpus tools are a way of identifying examples that I then analyze using more detailed qualitative type discourse analysis. So what are the functions? You know, is a metaphor conventional or creative? Is it extended? What kind of framings does it suggest, etc. So it is possible to combine, and sometimes really advisable to combine quantitative methods so that you have a fairly large set of examples from real data with detailed analysis in context of those examples when you found them. But I don't think it's possible to sort of, in every project, bring everything together. Unless you have a really large team where different people apply different methods. The crucial thing is to have the method or combination of methods that are the most appropriate for the questions you want to answer and the data that you have. And metaphor research in particular, and health communication research, tends to be quite eclectic in combining different methods, but I don't think you can combine all of the methods in one project.
Right. That would take a while then, right?
Yeah,
And
but
I think,
also it needs to make sense, right? So,
sure.
you know, for example, conversation analysis, you know, if the data is not interactive or not straightforwardly interactive, then it's not particularly relevant. Depends on your data.
Right. Perhaps it's really needed to assess the questions that you want to ask, and perhaps look at the data that you have before you could look at integrating different analytical tools and methodologies to answer such questions.
That's exactly it. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's have another question. Anyone who would like to turn on or unmute themselves and ask a question?
Hi, Elena. This is Rexa again. I just want to ask you one thing. You know, I enjoy all of your studies, and you know, I'm very much impressed with, you know, particularly impressed with the metaphor menu, because you know, it's kind of it's practical. You know, it translates research into something practical to the medical field. So I was wondering if, you know, what about other findings that you have, like the PAN questionnaire? Was it used for the kind of the redesign of the questionnaire at all, or other? I mean, the how to put the research findings into, you know, practical applications for the medical field. So I'd like to hear more from you about this. If you could. Yeah.
So the work on pain, in fact, both projects, the one on the questionnaire and the one on the pain cards, were done in collaboration with a clinician. And so the questionnaire has not been redesigned, partly because it's not our tool.
Right.
However, we have done many training sessions for healthcare professionals who deal with presenting the results that I've just given you. So I have given talks to healthcare professionals, and Joanna, the pain clinician I worked with, regularly uses some slides from our findings when she does training events. So that has been done many times. And I think what is useful is, and I've seen it when I've given talks myself, that even if because not everybody uses the questionnaire, but but our findings are still, and people who work with chronic pain are the importance of language, but I think what understanding of what might be involved and the importance of those choices. So we've done a lot in terms of training, and it was well received. We, as part of the current grant that I have, we are going to do more work on more questionnaires, and ultimately the goal that my pain clinician colleague has is to devise a new questionnaire that is corpus-based, and that might also include some visual images from the pain cards, so it's bringing everything together. But of course, that is a kind of long process. So for those things, it's mostly been training that we've done of healthcare professionals.
Yeah.
And the paid cards have been also are being used by people, and again, the artist who devised them does lots of workshops, including she's done workshops in other countries. She had a project in India, and the findings support the importance of using the images. So we've done a fair bit, but you know, these things are gradual, and it takes time. We have done, yeah. And I think collaborating from the beginning with researchers in healthcare or clinicians is important, because then you already have the connections. You're not trying to do the research independently, then trying to get someone who's interested in it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azan. We have a very interesting question here. The question goes, what useful tips can you share with us in handling sensitive respondents where caregivers or parents are involved? For example, I'm interested in children with Tourette syndrome, but sometimes parents intervene during the interview. It affects the validity and reliability of the data collected.
Yeah. So I've never actually done research that involves children, so I haven't had a problem myself. I guess in setting up your research and your data collection, you need to take into account the whole of the context and all of the dynamics that happen. And so maybe it's, you know, too easy for me to say this, but if you're interviewing a child in the presence of a parent, maybe you should take into account the fact that the parent might at some point become part of the conversation as part of your design, rather than somehow having to deal with it as a distraction. So in the pain data that we have in those consultations with the images, sometimes the patient has gone into the consultation alone. I should say there's always what in English is called a chaperone. So there's the consultant, there's usually a nurse who is there to support the patient, and especially if there are issues of gender. But then sometimes there is a family member who's come with the patient. And they intervene, and we just take that into account as part of the interaction. So I think you need to lay down the ground rules as much as you can. But otherwise, if a caregiver is present and the patient is a minor, it's probably unrealistic to expect that the parent will never talk. And so I think you just need to take it into account as part of the nature of your data. I mean, I have found myself, you know, many of you are parents too, that when my daughters were younger, when I went to medical consultations, there was one particular thing where we saw a particular consultant repeatedly for one of my daughters when she was 10, 11, 12. And I remember that he always just wanted to speak with her. And so he even got us to sit so that she was in front of him and I was in a corner. And yet I always ended up interrupting, even if I was aware that he didn't want to hear from me. Because it's very hard not to do that as a parent if you think, maybe wrongly, that you've got something to contribute. So I would make it part of either you have permission and all the ethical considerations are taken care of to interview the child without the parent present, but obviously that has its own complications. Otherwise, I think take it as part of the dynamics, because I don't think you can't end up having a kind of standoff with people who have consented to something like this. You've just got to take it all on board.
Thank you so much. That's quite a very wonderful topic, because I think there's a lot of people who would like to venture into health communication research, but the usual problem is, you know, getting access, and of course the ethical issues that surround talking to respondents, and perhaps other issues that would maybe refrain them from pursuing such study. Thank you so much. Do we have another question? Perhaps I would like to just dovetail that previous question earlier, maybe just to give people, let's say, a background as to how we could get started in doing health communication research. What should be the starting point? What should be like the preliminaries in preparing a research project that concerns this kind of topics?
Yeah. So, there is no easy answer, but there are sort of, I guess, different ways. One way is to start by talking to, and this is not straightforward, but talking to clinicians, for example, or medical researchers, where you're aware that there is an issue that might involve where linguistic research might be relevant, and basically say, look, have a conversation or do a presentation and say, we have these tools, we have these methods, we're able to answer these questions. Is there anything from your clinical practice or other aspects of your professional activities where this kind of research might be relevant? Do you have any questions that might need linguistic analysis as part of the answer? Because sometimes some of my projects have been initiated by questions that have come from outside. And sometimes I have basically said, this is what we can do, what can we do for you? But it's not straightforward, and sometimes it relies on luck or personal contacts or something like that. In my cases, I had no personal contacts as such, but I ended up being, introduced to various people, or it's not straightforward. Another possibility is to do some kind of initial study, possibly on data that be available, so that you do something, you do an initial study to demonstrate how your kind of work might be relevant to a particular aspect of communication in healthcare. And then when you've got the findings or some preliminary findings of your pilot study, to invite people from your medical school or people in your community and say, look, we've done this on a very limited data set. Is this of any relevance? Could this be of any relevance for you in the work that you do? And then sometimes then people do share data with you or help you get data. Or, there may be applications for funding. There are so many, I don't know about Ireland, and you guys are from different countries anyway. In the UK, there are lots of calls now for research on COVID. And this is where you might say, if you look at those calls, there might be some cases where you could go to somebody and say, are you interested in putting in a bid together where, we're dealing with this aspect, but linguistic research is relevant. So there are many different ways. I think what I would say is it takes time and persistence. So, and I'm glad actually that I have the chance to say this. So if you look at today and I give my presentation and I have all these people that it took me years and years to get to that point, because it takes time. People have their own priorities. They don't necessarily think that research is relevant. So it takes a lot of time and effort and patience and understanding other people's research questions, other people's pressures, not just your own, right? The thing is that when you then start having contacts and collaborating and speaking to different audiences, all of a sudden it becomes easier because you've got a track record.
Sure.
And so now, after all these years, I find it easier because I have a track record. So people come to me and say, I've got this data, can you help, right? But that is a long, long road. And you need to be patient, you need to be persistent, you shouldn't be, discouraged if it doesn't work at the beginning. What I would suggest though is you need to remember that it's not a matter of we do the research and then tell you how it is and you change your practices. It's a collaboration,
right?
So that different perspectives are always taken into account. It's not about us finding the answers and telling you what to do. It doesn't work. It needs to be a proper collaboration where the work is really truly combines the different perspectives and takes all the different insights into account.
Right. Thank you so much. That's really wonderful. We have one question from a lecturer at Thailand. Dr. Barami, you can now unmute your microphone.
Hello.
Hi, Parami.
Hi, this is a really interesting, very insightful. I have a question about whether you have thought about how to measure the impact of your research on the medical community, maybe the practitioners or patients. Thing is, I ask this question because recently researchers in Thailand are encouraged to do research that have measurable impacts on the community that we are involved with. So have you thought about that?
I've thought about that a lot because we have the same thing in the UK. And so I also have to provide evidence of the impact of my research. Again, there's not an easy answer to that. Right, so the way I've done it, and I'm actually doing right now because of an assessment that we have of impact of research in the UK, there are potentially multiple sources of evidence. So one source of evidence is from people in different fields. So, you know, for example, I have a testimonial letter from somebody in a local hospice here who talks about how I've given many talks in that hospice, how the research that we have done, because as you see, I do hardly anything alone. So testimonials, letters from people are one way. If you do training events, then or you speak to healthcare professionals, then sometimes just numbers of people who attended, and then feedback questionnaires from people who attended. When I speak to healthcare professionals, and I think it will apply everywhere, for them it's part of continuing professional development, and so it counts for something. So feedback is always collected very systematically. So numbers of people attending events and feedback is really important. Then there are some qualitative things. So like the fact that the metaphor menu has been recommended on the reading list by Cancer Research UK. It's a massive organization. They can even give me the number of hits, the number of downloads. The metaphor menu is available to anyone online, and I can see how many people have looked at it and downloaded it, but also there's a feedback form, and so which includes both open-ended and closed questions. So I've got numerical evidence of how useful people have said it is, and quotes from people. There's been quite a lot of media attention for the cancer metaphor research and a bit on COVID. So I have, you know, links to newspaper articles, and then my press office can provide average number of readers of those publications. If the metaphor menu is used in, you know, if people tell me we're using it in such and such a place. So I suppose the answer is, there isn't one single way of demonstrating impact. There are different ways of demonstrating impact that depend on the context you're working in. One thing you have to accept, and I have accepted it, is that you can't, you'll always have an underestimate of your impact, because when stuff is out there, you don't know. People don't tell you that they're using your research. Why should, you know, they don't even think about it. So I have sometimes found out by complete coincidence that the metaphor menu is being used in a particular place, just because I happen to have a conversation with somebody, nobody tells me. So yeah, you can't measure all of it, but you can provide different kinds of evidence for it. But do bear in mind, it takes a long time. If you listen to me now, it sounds like it's easy, but it hasn't been easy. And you need to be patient and learn from your mistakes, which, you know, in my case, you know, the metaphor menu came out of what I realized was a not very good answer to somebody, and etc. Yeah, and don't give up, because it gets easier. Once you've got collaborators, once you've got a bit of a track record, it does become easier. Right. And it's easier to get data, etc. And it's easier to demonstrate impact, but it is a process that takes quite a while.
Right. Thank you so much. Actually, the part of the metaphor in cancer remind me of one article I reviewed before. It's about promoting life review for people who had cancer.
Yeah.
I think that like the study of metaphor would really give perhaps them understanding on how to help these people who survive from cancer to like live their life, because most of them would always feel guilty about it. I have a personal friend who have that. He felt like, he felt like it's not fair that people around him need to stop their lives just because he had cancer rather. So I think the metaphor would really give so much light into that discussion.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no, that's okay. I was like trying to like think of several research projects looking into health communication because I'm doing linguistic landscape as a research, and your one of the studies you mentioned about showing images would actually make sense in the linguistic landscape research, particularly on, let's say, cancer wards, the signs that are posted there. How does that help them to cope with what you're going through? So that's very interesting.
Yes, I agree. I agree. I'm putting the link to the metaphor menu in the chat, so if people want to look at it, you're very welcome. But yes, you're absolutely right. And actually, there is another thing where to get started maybe is to look at the changes that have been caused by COVID as well. So in hospitals, I think apart from the fact that people can't go visit people in hospital, at least right now, not in the UK. If somebody goes to hospital, nobody can go and see them. But hospitals, for example, have reorganized themselves so that in some cases there's a kind of COVID lane and a non-COVID lane, so that keep people separate. And of course, signage is very important. Public messaging is hugely important. I have a meeting this afternoon about public messages here in my local area. And the other thing that maybe that is worth studying, and that there's a big project in the UK, is on remote consultations. So the fact that now, I imagine it's happened in Thailand too, that a dramatic shift to audio or video consultations with doctors rather than in person. And that is a massive thing that involves the affordances of technology, but also how you adapt your communication, how you do all those things like establishing a relationship, conveying empathy, exchange information, facilitate, enable people to ask questions when you're speaking like we are now, rather than in person. So looking at what the changes caused by COVID could also be a good starting point.
True, especially that there's a very rich data right now, specifically like, as you mentioned, the public messages and several public announcements. So I think we have another one question. Let's see. Would you like to read this,
Yeah,
Ruby?
it just came into my mind that you are on Twitter. And I think with the COVID right now, we are lucky that we are on social media. And the pictures that you said, pictures posted have a lot of impact on people. So sometimes people would just post on images on Facebook or on the Instagram. So in that case, what do you have to say? Because people like me, I would follow a lot of social media and I would get influenced by these images. Like especially now that we're in COVID, like we would see people crying and just the image of them not being able to meet the dying old person, like with the door, like you can't touch each other. So what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I think basically social media can be several things. It can be a source of data, and like you're talking about, what images are used and what they're what patterns there are and what the implications might be. So social media can be a really useful source of data. You need to deal with the ethical issues and depending on what you want to do, etc. I haven't done much research at all using social media as data, but many other people have, and I may do that in future. And certainly some of the metaphors that we collected on COVID come from social media. Yes, so you can use social media as a data source, bearing ethical considerations in mind. I primarily use Twitter to interact with different people and disseminate my research. And it can be quite useful to keep in touch with audiences who are outside your field. So, there are, I can use it to communicate with people interested in metaphor, but I have other ways to communicate with people interested in metaphor. We go to the same conferences, we read the same journal articles, etc. But if I want to communicate with people who work in cancer care or end-of-life care, or journalists sometimes, Twitter or social media, but Twitter in particular, I found really, really useful. And to disseminate the metaphor menu, for example, Twitter has been really useful. And I've had contacts through Twitter that have been useful. So yes, it's useful both as a data source for some projects, but also for dissemination and to achieve impact eventually. Because remember, the impact is the outcome of a process of engagement with people. And that process, and we need to focus on the engagement. And also, I've seen something in the chat. Sorry, I think I hope I've answered your question, Ruby. Let me say something back about impact, because I think this is at least important to me. So we get assessed, right? So we've got this problem that around the world, academics are now pressurized to prove the impact of their research. Okay, it happens in Thailand, it happens in the UK. And it's not something that most of us, especially people my age, were even trained to do, because when I was young, this wasn't a requirement. And the training for that and the way to think about that is not straightforward. But all of a sudden, the policy changes, and now we all have to do it. So first of all, we need to bear in mind that the way in which people who put pressure on us put things may not be the best way to think about it. So we need to find a way of rephrasing things or putting things in a way that is meaningful to us, and having the right process. As I say, there's no point getting stressed about impact if you haven't thought about engagement. Right? You need to think about engagement. You need to think how you work with people, how you reach people, people can influence you as well as you influence them. And then eventually you might find some evidence that something has changed because of you. But the other thing that I find in my research, and maybe I'm in a privileged position because now I don't have to worry, like many younger people do, about getting promotion or anything like that. But the crucial thing is, what keeps you going every day is what is meaningful to you, not the pressures and the rules and the wordings of your university. And I think for me, when I do this kind of work, it means something to me that, for example, for menu exists and it is used, right? And so that is what keeps me motivated. It's, for some of you, it's internal versus external motivation if you study language teaching, right? You need to find a way of turning the external pressures into internal motivation. And when it's internal motivation, it's not a chore anymore. But there are consequences to that. So for example, I made the decision to make the metaphor menu available to anyone, okay? That means I have no control over who uses it. And most of the time, I will never find out. And people are surprised and say, well, why did you do that? Because if you keep it closed and people have to ask you, then you have control. And I said, I don't want control because it means that fewer people use. So if the consequence is that people use it and I never find out, I'd rather have that than having control, but fewer people using it. And so that is a decision that I made. But actually, if you do that, you do eventually, some people do tell you, enough people do tell you. And I do say, if you look at the website, if you can, please let us know. Mm-hmm. But because fundamentally, my priority is that it is useful, not that I can count precisely. And I've always got enough to count. But turn it into internal motivation, otherwise it will just make you stressed.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Elena. I would say that this talk is very, very insightful. I mean, I enjoy listening to researches that looks into issues that are always overlooked, I would say, particularly in language researches. So this is really like the question on impact poses indeed a pressure, but it also challenges us to develop projects that are not just interesting, but also relevant to the needs of the society. And it gives us that opportunity to voice and to share our researches to everyone. So we thank you a lot for your time. It's truly an honor listening to you. We truly enjoy your session. At this point, we would like to maybe open just one more question if there's someone who would like to raise another question. I believe that everyone is now thinking of their possible research projects. Because your talk really opened several, you know, research interests, like research topics that many people could get started. Specifically, your take on how we can get things to how can we start a research project by looking at perhaps determining the shareholders, determining connection or network, just so we can make things work for us. Oh, there you go. We have one question. May I ask, what do you think creative metaphor of COVID as glitters?
Yeah, I suppose back into my disuse and how it's used. But I actually think it's great. I think there are, so obviously glitter is a good thing, is a fun thing, and COVID isn't. So it has a very specific use. And this is really important with metaphors, and we've seen it in other research, that fire metaphors have a wider range of applications. The glitter metaphor is very specific. We can't allow it to be misinterpreted as, oh, then it's harmless, like glitter. No, the glitter metaphor has a very specific function, which is to capture the fact that we're dealing with something that is very difficult to completely eradicate, and that you can look around and think it's gone, and it's not gone, right? And in that sense, it makes that very accessible. And it has an element of humor that sometimes we need, right? Even in a negative situation. So it's one of those metaphors that has a very specific framing function, and it can be sort of, you can't extend it and apply it to different aspects. But in terms of that, it works very well. And you know, if you want to explain to a child that the virus may be there, but you can't see it, and even after you've done a lot to try to get rid of it, it might still be there in small quantities. Glitter might be a good way of doing it. So I think it can be really useful, but it's not one of those that has multiple uses and functions. It has a very specific one.
All right, thank you so much. Once again, thank you for an eye-opening talk that makes us, you know, assess the relevance of the researches that we are doing. Thank you so much. And before I let everyone go, I would like to invite you on our last web series, which is happening next week. Let me share my screen. All right, so for next week, we will have our session on local and global languages in the linguistic landscape of tourism, which is happening on the 16th of July at 9 o'clock to 11 o'clock Thailand time, which will be delivered by Professor Christina Higgins from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you so much, Professor Elena, for your time and for your wonderful session.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
What time is it?
It's nearly midday.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Bye everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.